Recently, archaeologists made a surprising discovery in Jerusalem, an ancient temple that is not exactly the famous Temple of Jerusalem. This mysterious structure was carved into the side of a rock, a short distance from the legendary Temple of Solomon, but it is a completely different place of worship. In this video, we will dive into the details of this fascinating discovery, directly from the academic paper published by experts from the Israel Antiquities Authority. And more than that, we will explore what this find can reveal about religious practice in the region at that time. Will this temple change what we know about faith and rituals of the past? This news has already appeared in some Brazilian portals, such as this one, which highlights the discovery of a sanctuary sealed almost 3,000 years ago in Jerusalem. However, instead of just following the headlines, let's go straight to the original source, the academic paper published in the Journal of the Israel Antiquities Authority. The title of the study: Evidence of Worship in Rock-Cut Environments on the Eastern Slope of the City of David, Jerusalem. These structures are actually 8 rooms that have been excavated since 2010. When archaeologists began analyzing the data from this excavation, their first suspicion was that these rooms were ancient tombs. It made sense at first, but new evidence completely changed that idea. In an article published in 2024, experts revised this conclusion and pointed out something much more intriguing. This was not a cemetery, but rather a cult complex, that is, a temple. The reason? A series of objects and structures found at the site indicate without a shadow of a doubt that religious rituals took place there. This change in interpretation becomes even clearer when we analyze 3 specific rooms within this complex. In total, the archaeological site has 8 rooms, numbered from 1 to 8 on the map. But what really interests us are 3 key rooms: Room 5, or Room C, Room 4, and Room 1, which contain the most enigmatic and revealing elements of the excavation. 2. Better understand this structure, here is an artistic reconstruction of the most important rooms. In this image, we see Room C, marked by patterns carved into the stone that still defy experts. Next to it, Room 4, where a central structure stands out and may have been essential in the rituals. And finally, Room 1, which also contains a mysterious architectural feature. Room 4 and the rock-cut architecture. Let's start with Room 4, because it gives us a clear view of how this temple was built. Unlike other ancient structures made of bricks or stacked stones, this room was excavated directly into the rock, as if it were a tunnel, creating a space carved into the mountain itself. For this reason, it is part of what archaeologists call rock-cut rooms, that is, rooms carved into the rock. And here is one of the most impressive finds from this room: a raised platform located in the deepest part of the room. But what really catches the eye is what is on this platform: a stone stele, known in Hebrew as maba. These raised stones are not common. Throughout history, in various cultures, they have often marked sacred places where something extraordinary happened. In ancient Israel, these mabas were symbols of divine revelations, appearances of gods, or portals to the celestial world. This simple detail completely transforms the way we understand this place. It was not just a set of rooms carved into the rock, but rather a space of connection between the human and divine worlds. The relationship with biblical tradition. The Sikhs' biblical narrative of Genesis, there is a striking scene involving Jacob. One night he sleeps on a rock and has an impressive vision: angels ascending and descending from heaven. Upon waking, Jacob realizes that this place was special, the house of the Lord, and gives it the name Bethel, which means precisely house of God. But he does more than just name the place. He raises the stone on which he slept, anoints it with oil, and establishes rituals and offerings that should be performed there. Now, regardless of whether this story happened exactly this way, what really matters is that this type of practice was part of the cultural and religious mindset of the people who wrote the biblical texts. The idea of marking a sacred place with standing stones was common not only in the Hebrew tradition, but in many cultures of the ancient world. This was done by different peoples, in different contexts, but always with a similar objective: to record an encounter with the sacred. The importance of the discovery. This brings us to the main point, the discovery of a maba, a standing stone stele, inside this archaeological complex in Jerusalem. When we compare this find with other altars and temples already found in the Levant region, including sites in Israel and Judah, it becomes clear that we are not dealing with just any structure. Everything indicates that this place was a cult, complex, a space of worship. And this becomes even more intriguing when we remember the location of this structure. Jerusalem, according to biblical texts, was the official center of worship of Yahweh, the patron god of Israel and Judah, from at least 1000 BC, until the destruction of the temple by the Babylonians in 586 BC. This means that what we find here may be a parallel temple, a place of worship that coexisted with the famous temple in Jerusalem. But that's not the only interesting detail. Here we have another view of this maba, this time from above. There is something curious about the way this stone was found. It was not destroyed, nor was it simply abandoned in a corner. On the contrary, it was lying down and covered with earth, as if it had been carefully hidden. Why would someone hide a sacred object in this way? We will explore this question later, but before that, let's go to another area of this complex. The fifth room, which also contains some fascinating finds. Room 5 and its mysteries. Right away, we see deep grooves in the floor, which indicate some type of specific use. The problem is that archaeologists still do not have a definitive answer about its function. There are some hypotheses. It could be a base to fit a wooden structure that did not survive the passage of time, perhaps a loom, since loom weights were found there. Another possibility is that these grooves were part of a press to extract olive oil or grape juice, substances that were of great importance in religious rituals of the time. The curious thing is that, until now, there is no known parallel for this structure in other archaeological sites in Israel, Judah, or nearby regions. This makes interpretation even more challenging. But there is another element in this room that is easier to understand. A chamber at the back, where several objects were found accumulated in different layers. This indicates that this space functioned as a geniza, or favish, a type of deposit used to store sacred items that could not be discarded, but were also no longer in use. In the later Jewish context, for example, documents with the name of God written on them could not simply be thrown away. They were stored in these genizas. In ancient times, the same principle applied to idols, statues, and other objects of religious value, which, even if they were damaged, had to be stored in a designated space. This practice was not exclusive to Judaism. In ancient Greece, for example, temples also had similar storage facilities to store religious icons that had worn away over time. With all this in mind, it is clear that we are dealing with an archaeological site of great religious importance, which helps us better understand the spiritual beliefs and practices of the time. But what else can this structure reveal? Let's continue exploring the details of this discovery. When something is considered sacred, it cannot be simply discarded as ordinary trash, but neither does it want to be left exposed, taking up space or deteriorating. The solution? Bury it ceremonially. In many archaeological sites, we find votive pits where religious objects were carefully deposited, creating true treasures for archaeology and history. What makes this discovery even more fascinating is the fact that this particular chamber was sealed by a wall, which helped to preserve its contents over the centuries. When archaeologists finally opened it, it was like an explosion of materiality, a rich set of artifacts that allow us to reconstruct essential aspects of the past. In this fifth room, for example, we found a favissa, a space reserved for storing religious items that were no longer in use. This is a strong indication that the room had a cultic function, since this type of structure is always associated with sacred sites. But what exactly was found inside? The objects recovered include ceremonial jars possibly used for offerings, as well as a number of other enigmatic artifacts. There were loom weights, some fragmented and some whole, suggesting the presence of a textile industry at the site. Stone or ceramic seals, similar to those used to seal letters and documents, were also present. Another intriguing find were scarabs, small, oblong objects common in Egypt and throughout the Levant that could serve as both amulets and seals. In addition, the archaeologists found small figurines, grinding stones, beads and stone vessels, and even animal and fish bones. The presence of bones may indicate food or even ritual sacrifices, although fish is a somewhat more unusual element in religious contexts of the time. The most striking thing is the location of this favish, very close to the temple in Jerusalem. It was far enough away that it was not officially part of the temple complex, but close enough to indicate a strong connection with religious practice. The big question is, who was worshipped in this space? Here, one of the greatest challenges of this investigation arises. There are no inscriptions or textual records that make it clear whether this parallel temple was dedicated exclusively to Yahweh, the God of Israel and Judah, or whether it was a place of worship for other deities, such as Baal, Asherah, or Astarte, who were also worshipped in the region. Without texts that confirm the identity of the deity worshipped, archaeologists must rely exclusively on material evidence, and it is precisely by comparing the styles of ceramics, seals, statuettes, and other artifacts with those found in other archaeological sites that it has been possible to estimate the date of this sanctuary. Analyses indicate that this parallel temple began to be used around 1300–1200 BC, at the end of the Bronze Age, that is, before the construction of Solomon's temple. It continued in use until around 750 BC, during the Iron Age 2B. This means that this space was in operation for at least 500 years, through centuries of political and religious transformations. This was not, therefore, an improvised temple created by a rebellious priest or a dissident group. It played an established and lasting role in the religious practice of Jerusalem. And there is one more intriguing detail. In Room 1, archaeologists found a peculiar structure, a raised platform and a small canal that extends to the outside of the room. Experts speculate that this platform could have been the base of an altar. If this was indeed a place of worship, where was the altar? This structure may be the answer. Another element that reinforces this theory is the presence of the favisa, where religious objects were stored. In many ancient temples, the altar and the stele, a raised stone that represented the presence of the deity, were two separate structures. If this is confirmed, we are faced with a complete cult complex, a parallel temple hidden in the surroundings of the Great Temple of Jerusalem. The findings from this archaeological site are essential for understanding the religious diversity of the region and the complexity of worship practices. But what else can this structure reveal? Let's continue exploring the details of this discovery. In the ancient world, religious worship was not just a matter of faith, but also of space and physicality. The gods were concrete presences, often represented by stones, statues, or other sacred objects. The rituals were carefully structured to create a link between the earth and the divine. The altar, for example, was the place where the faithful made sacrifices and offerings. However, these tributes were not always deposited directly at the feet of the representation of the deity. In many cases, the offerings had to rise to the heavens in the form of smoke, carrying a pleasant aroma to the god who, despite being symbolically present in the stone, was also conceived as a celestial being. If we compare this dynamic with the Temple of Jerusalem, the relationship between the altar and the divine presence becomes clearer. In the temple, the Holy of Holies represented the densest and most sacred presence of Yahweh, while the altar was outside, in the open air, allowing the smoke of the sacrifices to rise to the sky. This conception of divinity was not strictly geographical. It was not a god who could be located by a GPS, but rather a presence that occupied multiple spaces at the same time, especially in places considered sacred. This brings us to an intriguing question about the archaeological structure. We are analyzing. If this discovered platform was in fact the base of an altar, it makes sense that the small channel found next to it would have served to drain ritual liquids, such as wine, olive oil, or even the fat and juices of the sacrificed meat. This possibility reinforces the hypothesis that Room 1 of this archaeological site was a sacrificial space, a fundamental location within this possible parallel temple. But what is the real importance of this discovery? How does this temple fit into the history of the ancient kingdoms of Judah and Israel? And most importantly, what does this archaeological evidence tell us about the religion of the time compared to what we find in the Bible? Here we enter fascinating territory. The biblical texts, despite being valuable sources about the period, were written from the perspective of a specific group within Judah, an elite that promoted a monotheistic and centralized vision of the worship of Yahweh. These texts emphasize that there was only one correct form of worship, and often describe deviations from this practice as religious corruption, promoted by unfaithful kings or a disobedient people. But does this vision represent the entire religious reality of the period? Archaeology suggests not. When we look at the material evidence, we find a much greater diversity of religious practices than the Bible implies. Popular worship seemed to be more complex, decentralized and plural, including the veneration of other deities such as Baal, Asherah, and Astarte, figures that biblical texts often condemn, but that, in practice, seem to play a relevant role in local religiosity. A good way to understand this difference between official religion and practiced religion is to imagine that we are studying Catholicism only through the official documents of the Church. If we base ourselves exclusively on papal bulls and Vatican decrees, we might get the impression that all Catholics have rigidly followed dogmas throughout history. However, when we analyze popular devotion, such as religious practices in the interior of Maranhão or in villages in Sri Lanka, we realize that the experience of faith can be much more diverse than official norms indicate. This is exactly what archaeology does with the biblical accounts. It puts them into perspective. The Bible gives us a narrative about the religion of that time, but material evidence shows that this narrative was only one of the possible versions. And this brings us to a crucial question. When a biblical author criticizes a king for doing evil in the eyes of the Lord, was he really condemning religious corruption, or merely reproving practices that diverged from the tradition promoted by the priests of Jerusalem? This discovery allows us to question the boundaries between theology and history, between faith and the concrete reality of the ancient world. When we look at the religious history of Judah and Israel, we often see this trajectory through the eyes of the biblical authors, especially those linked to the priesthood of Jerusalem. For them, there was an ideal model of worship: exclusive, centralized in the Temple of Jerusalem and dedicated only to Yahweh. Any religious practice outside of this standard, such as the existence of other temples, altars, or the veneration of different deities, was seen as wrong and condemnable. But was this the reality experienced by ordinary people at the time? If a king built or maintained temples outside of Jerusalem, he did not see it as a mistake or sin. On the contrary, he probably believed he was doing what was right in the eyes of the gods. The same goes for the population. People worshiped not only Yahweh, but also household gods, ancestors, and regional deities, carrying small cult statuettes in their homes and sacred spaces. Archaeology offers us thousands of these statuettes found in Israel and Judah, a physical testimony to the religious diversity that existed in that region, regardless of the official narrative we find in the biblical texts. And this diversity was not theoretical, it had physical spaces. The discovery of this religious complex near Jerusalem is important evidence of this. It shows that, in addition to the great central temple, other places of worship were considered legitimate by many people of the time. This leads us to reflect on how the real religious experience was much more varied than the biblical account suggests. Another crucial point is the impact of the religious reforms promoted by kings such as Hezekiah and Josiah between the 8th and 7th centuries BC. The biblical texts narrate that these kings closed temples, eliminated priests, and centralized worship exclusively in Jerusalem, and archaeology seems to confirm that something like this happened. The temple we analyzed may have been one of those that were closed during this period. Archaeologists who excavated the site believe that, to prevent its destruction, the priests themselves sealed the temple before the royal troops arrived, carefully burying the sacred objects. Something similar was found at the Temple of Arad, another parallel temple of great importance. The case of Arad is interesting because there we found 3 stelae, small sacred monuments, that were originally standing but were discovered lying down and covered with earth. In addition, there were 2 smaller altars, possibly for burning incense, which suggests a much richer and more diverse cult practice than the Bible admits. Some interpretations suggest that this temple was dedicated to Yahweh and his consort, Asherah, an idea that does not fit with the monotheistic theology that took hold later. But, as always, archaeology reminds us that the past was more complex than official records tell us, and it was not just in Arad. Over the years, several temples and places of worship have been discovered throughout Israel and Judah, some of which were still in operation after the Assyrian domination. This confirms something that the biblical texts themselves mention: the existence of several places of worship, although condemned by the authors who wrote these texts. Therefore, this discovery is not a revolution that changes everything we knew, but it expands our understanding, providing new evidence about how religion was really lived. What this excavation ultimately shows us is that religiosity in the region was complex, diverse, and constantly changing. There were not only different temples dedicated to Yahweh, but also places of worship for other Canaanite gods, foreign gods, and even domestic and ancestral deities. And this is not something rare. These practices appear repeatedly in archaeological excavations. This type of discovery invites us to look at the religion of ancient Israel with a broader perspective, based not only on what the Bible says, but also on what the material evidence reveals to us. And this is a topic that is worth exploring further. In future videos, we may look at other fascinating archaeological sites that help reconstruct the religiosity of this period from a historical and archaeological perspective. As always, thank you very much for watching, and see you in the next video. Thank you.